He wasn't looking for danger that morning. He was just a man trying to find peace in the silence of the Appalachian woods. But when his loyal German shepherd, Arrow, stopped on the trail and refused to move, he led Joe to something no one was ever meant to find. A sealed iron door buried beneath the ferns, and a faint voice crying for help from the darkness below. Inside that forgotten bunker lay a dying woman clutching a locked case, her trembling lips whispering a secret that could change not only his life, but perhaps the nation itself. What she told him wasn't just classified. It was divine. If you believe that miracles can still find us in the darkest corners of this world, then this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and leave a comment to tell us how faith has guided your path. Thank you for being here, and may God bless you always. The Appalachian wilderness woke beneath a pale autumn sky, its mist moving like a ghostly tide between the ridges of West Virginia. The sun was weak, filtered through silver-gray clouds, and the forest smelled of damp soil and pine resin. A cold wind swept through the hollows, rattling the branches and scattering the last red leaves that clung stubbornly to the oaks. The world felt empty, untouched, and endless, exactly the kind of solitude Joe Miller had sought when he left the noise of the world behind. Joe was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the posture of a man who had once lived by precision and command. His hair was dark brown, streaked with early gray at the temples, his jaw rough with stubble, and the lines around his eyes carried years of exhaustion and quiet grief. There was a steadiness to him, the way he moved, the way his eyes took in everything, that spoke of old training and deeper scars. After 2 tours as a Marine in Afghanistan, Joe had returned home not to people, but to silence. The cabin he built here on the edge of the Appalachians was more than shelter. It was an apology to the world and a refuge from it. His only companion now padded through the mist ahead of him, a 4-year-old German shepherd named Arrow. The dog's coat was a striking blend of ash gray and snow white, thick and healthy despite the mountain chill. His amber eyes were bright, intelligent, constantly scanning, as if even the breeze could whisper danger. Arrow had a scar across his left hind leg from a trap he'd once escaped as a pup, and Joe often said it made the dog look like he'd seen war too. Together they made an odd pair, one man retreating from ghosts, one dog forever ready to face them. It was early morning, the hour Joe loved most. The air was sharp with frost, his breath visible in front of him. He moved carefully through the underbrush, rifle slung across his back, his gloved hand brushing aside low branches. Arrow was tracking deer, a morning ritual more about focus than food. Hunting kept Joe's mind from wandering to the places it shouldn't go. The crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the rhythm of Arrow's paws, the smell of pine. It was meditation disguised as survival. They had followed a trail for nearly 2 miles when Arrow's behavior changed. His tail stiffened, his head lifted, and his ears turned sharply to the left. The dog let out a low growl, not of threat, but of curiosity, and began pulling away from the main game trail, ignoring the fresh hoof prints they had been following. "What is it, boy?" Joe murmured, voice low and steady. He trusted Arrow's instincts more than his own. The German shepherd led him downhill through tangled brush, nose twitching as he caught something unseen. The forest thickened. The air grew colder. The soft loam underfoot gave way to damp moss, and Joe could feel the faint vibration of running water somewhere below. Then he saw it, a small rise of earth, almost hidden by ferns and old vines. that didn't belong to the natural lay of the land. Arrow stopped, ears forward, staring intently at the mound. Joe approached slowly, crouching beside the dog. The ground here had been disturbed recently. The soil was loose and uneven, and there was a faint metallic glint beneath the layer of dead leaves. He brushed the debris aside with his gloved hand and froze. Beneath the camouflaging layer of ferns lay a steel door, half buried in the earth. It was old, the paint flaking in pale green curls, but the scratches near the latch were fresh, cutting through to raw metal. Beside them, a small streak of dried blood glimmered rust red in the weak light. Joe's heartbeat slowed, a familiar calm that came not from peace but from practiced control. His training whispered through muscle memory. Observe, assess, act. Someone had forced this door recently, and whoever they were, they hadn't gone far. He crouched closer, tracing the edge of the steel with his fingers. The hinges were cold, solid, but slightly bent, as if the door had been pried open in haste, then slammed shut again. Arrow sniffed the air, then whined softly, his body tense. Joe scanned the immediate area. Something else caught his attention. A makeshift tripwire, thin fishing line strung between two rocks. It had already been snapped, the small metal bell tied to it lying silent in the moss. A simple alarm, the kind a desperate person might rig to warn them of pursuit. Whoever entered the hatch had been hunted. Joe's mind raced. It wasn't unusual to find remnants of old military installations here. Cold War bunkers, mines, forgotten shelters. But fresh blood and a broken alarm changed everything. He stood up, glancing at Arrow. The dog's fur bristled slightly, but his eyes stayed locked on Joe, waiting for command. "Stay sharp," Joe said quietly, reaching to unclip his flashlight from his belt. He tested the door. It gave a faint groan, but didn't resist. Cold air seeped out, carrying a scent of metal, oil, and damp earth. The kind of smell that belonged to a place long sealed away. He hesitated only for a second. Logic said turn back, report it, maybe return with rangers or local authorities. But logic had never been his compass. Joe had seen too much of what bureaucracy did to truth. In the mountains, there were no reports, no committees, just instinct and consequence. He tightened the strap of his backpack, adjusted his headlamp, and spoke softly. "Arrow, heel." The dog moved to his side instantly, posture low and ready. Together they stepped closer. Joe knelt beside the door again, set his flashlight beam across its face, and found a small embossed marking, property of U.S. Department of Defense, almost erased by time. He exhaled slowly. Whatever this place was, it wasn't meant to be found. Arrow pawed at the dirt near the hinge, nose working furiously. The dog's behavior turned urgent. He whined again, deeper this time, and scratched at the soil. Joe shone the light along the ground and saw faint boot prints, half washed by rain but still visible. They led from the tree line to the door, then stopped. No return prints. Someone had gone in. No one had come out. The realization sat heavy in his chest. He touched the latch, then paused, listening. Nothing but the slow rustle of wind through leaves and the faint trickle of a stream nearby. No voices, no motion. He pushed gently, and the hinges gave with a reluctant squeal. Cold air rolled out, heavy and stale, smelling faintly of mold and iron. A narrow staircase descended into the dark, swallowed by shadow. Joe turned on his headlamp. The beam cut a pale cone through the dust, revealing concrete walls slick with condensation. The first few steps were damp and slick. He drew his pistol, not out of fear, but habit, and glanced at Arrow. The dog's tail was down, muscles taut. He gave a single nod, and they began to descend. Each step echoed faintly, swallowed almost immediately by the weight of the underground. The light flickered across old pipes and cables along the walls, some still intact, others corroded into silence. Joe's breath came slow and even, the rhythm steady, disciplined. Halfway down, he stopped and crouched. There were smears of dried blood on the handrail, faint but unmistakable, and a dropped flashlight resting on the landing. The lens was cracked, the battery compartment scorched. Whoever had carried it had gone further in, bleeding, panicked, but alive long enough to leave a trail. Joe picked it up, studied the scorch mark. Maybe gunfire, maybe an explosion, maybe just a desperate scramble. The silence below was total. He felt Arrow press lightly against his leg, as if reminding him he wasn't alone. "All right, boy," he whispered. "Looks like we've found something we shouldn't have." The dog let out a low breath through his nose, steady and sure, and the two continued downward, into the cold, into the dark, toward whatever waited beneath the mountain. The staircase ended in a narrow corridor that stretched deep into the earth, the air growing colder with every step. Moisture clung to the concrete walls, dripping from rusted pipes overhead. The faint hum of dying generators echoed somewhere ahead, their failing rhythm pulsing like a weak heartbeat. Joe swept his light across faded signs on the walls: federal property, restricted access. The letters half-eaten by mold. Dust floated through the beam like ash suspended in water. Arrow moved beside him, silent, nose twitching, every muscle tight with alertness. A flicker of light blinked far down the passage. Joe froze, lowering the flashlight. It wasn't his reflection. It was a weak, sputtering glow, a survival lamp running on its last fumes. He motioned for Arrow to stay low and advanced cautiously, his boots silent against the wet floor. The air smelled faintly of copper and smoke. When he reached the corner, he saw her. The woman lay half-propped against the wall, her right arm limp across her lap. Blood had soaked through the torn fabric of her dark tactical jacket and pooled beneath her. The insignia on her shoulder was barely visible, but Joe could still make out the letters. FAD, Federal Agency Division. Her breathing was shallow, the kind of rattle that came from lungs losing the fight. A Pelican case, military-grade, matte black, rested against her leg, and beside it, a sidearm she hadn't managed to raise. She looked up as Joe approached, her eyes sharp despite the pain. "Don't move too fast," she rasped, her voice steady but thin. "You're not one of them." Joe holstered his weapon and crouched beside her. "Name's Joe Miller. I'm not with anyone." She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing a little. "Laura," she said after a pause, each word strained. "Agent Laura Brooks. I thought no one would find this place." Laura was in her late 30s, her face striking even beneath layers of grime and exhaustion. Her skin, pale under the harsh LED glow, was streaked with dirt and blood. Short auburn hair clung damply to her forehead, and her green eyes, bright, analytical, almost defiant, carried the same weary determination Joe had seen in soldiers who refused to die before finishing the mission. She wore a black tactical vest over a faded gray undershirt, the kind issued to deep-cover operatives. One sleeve was shredded by a bullet wound, the fabric blackened around the edges from powder burns. Joe tore open his pack, pulling out a small first aid kit. "Hold still," he muttered, slicing the sleeve further to expose the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, grazing the shoulder bone but missing the artery by luck. He worked quickly, cleaning the blood, packing the wound with gauze, wrapping it tight. Laura flinched once, but didn't cry out. "You're trained," she said quietly. "Marine Corps," Joe replied without looking up. "A long time ago." Laura managed, a faint, humorless smile. "Then you know what happens when the wrong people start digging where they shouldn't." Joe didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that some truths didn't need confirming. Arrow stayed near the doorway, ears flicking back and forth. The dog's amber eyes followed every sound, his body a taut spring of vigilance. Occasionally, he growled low, the noise vibrating in his chest like a warning drum. Laura tried to shift her position and gasped softly, clutching the bandage. Joe steadied her with a hand on her uninjured shoulder. "Don't move. You're losing blood." "Already lost enough," she said with a grim chuckle that turned into a cough. "Listen to me, Joe. I need you to take that case." Joe glanced at the Pelican box. The lock was biometric, military issue, the kind used for sensitive intel transport. "What's in it?" "Proof," she said. "Reed's people. They were smuggling next-gen weapon prototypes to private buyers. We got wind of it too late. They ambushed my team outside Charleston. I barely made it here." Joe frowned. "Reed? Isabella Reed? Aegis Tactical?" Laura nodded weakly. "You know her name?" "I've heard it. Contracted work overseas. People said she built armies for profit." "She builds ghosts now," Laura whispered. "And if she finds this data, she'll bury me and anyone who touches it." Joe's gaze hardened. He'd seen men like Reed in uniform and out of it. People who sold blood as strategy. "You locked the door upstairs?" "Yes. Manual override. Bought me a few hours." Her head tilted slightly as she looked toward the tunnel behind Joe. "But their drones will find this place soon. They jammed our comms. My backup's dead." Joe checked her pulse. It was weak and fluttering. "You need a medic. Closest town's 20 miles. "Too late," she said simply. "You know it, and I know it." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant drip of water and Arrow's slow, rhythmic breathing. Then Laura lifted a trembling hand, motioning toward the case. "There's an external drive inside. Encrypted. But I set up a failsafe. A coordinate string burned into the metadata. It leads to a second cache. You'll need both to decrypt the full data set." Joe opened the lid carefully. Inside was a ruggedized laptop, a sealed hard drive, and a folded satellite map streaked with her blood. He didn't understand the encryption, but he knew the look of classified evidence. "Who's your contact?" he asked. "Ben Carter," she whispered. "Investigative journalist. Works for the Independent Review. Trustworthy, stubborn bastard." Her eyes flickered with something almost like pride. "If I don't make it, give him the data. He'll know what to do." Joe nodded slowly. "All right. You hold on, Agent?" Laura smiled faintly, exhaustion softening her sharp features. "You sound like command. You still believe in orders?" "Not really," Joe said, "but I believe in finishing what someone started." She tried to laugh, but only coughed again, her body trembling. Joe adjusted her posture, propping her against the wall. Arrow moved closer, lying across the entrance as if guarding them from the ghosts of the tunnel. Laura's gaze lingered on the dog. "He's beautiful," she murmured. "Best damn soldier I've ever had," Joe replied. "Then you'll make it." Her voice was fading, each word costing her more. "The coordinates. They're in the file labeled Echo Fall. Passcode fragment, Sierra 49 Delta. That's all I could set before." She winced, breath catching. "Before they hit us." Her eyes unfocused slightly. Joe touched her cheek, trying to keep her awake. "Hey, stay with me, Laura. You're not done yet." She blinked, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. "We never really are." Her head sagged against the wall. For a moment, Joe thought she'd stopped breathing, but then a shallow rise of her chest proved otherwise. He sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. The dim light above them flickered again, once, twice, then steadied into a sickly amber glow. The hum of the generator faltered. Arrow whined softly, turning his head toward the dark corridor beyond. Joe followed the sound, metal creaking somewhere deeper in the hulk of the bunker. The outside world was coming. Joe tightened the bandage around Laura's shoulder, checked her pulse one last time. It fluttered, but still beat. He gathered the pelican case, slung it across his back, and whispered to the dog, "Guard the entrance." Arrow's ears perked, and he lowered himself into a crouch, eyes fixed on the black mouth of the tunnel. Joe looked at the unconscious agent once more. Her face had gone pale as the concrete behind her, yet her expression held something fierce. A woman who had fought to the last breath, not for survival, but for truth. He stood in the failing light, his voice low and rough. "You're not alone down here." Then he stepped deeper into the dark, the pelican case clutched tight, as the bunker's dying heartbeat slowed to silence. The dim emergency lights along the corridor sputtered once, twice, then steadied into a low, amber pulse. Joe stood over Laura's still form, the pelican case slung across his back and the cold taste of iron in the air. The hum of the generator had faded into silence, leaving only the soft hiss of leaking pipes and the faint, rhythmic drip of water echoing through the tunnels. Arrow pressed close to Joe's leg, his ears erect, nostrils flaring. Something in the air had changed. Pressure, scent, or instinct. Joe could feel it too. They weren't alone anymore. A distant clang rang out, metallic and sharp. Joe's training flared to life. He extinguished his headlamp and crouched low, guiding Arrow with a silent hand signal. The German Shepherd moved like smoke, melting into the dark with barely a sound. From deeper in the bunker came a murmur of voices, faint but distinct. Joe recognized the cadence of soldiers, short, efficient, deadly. He eased forward until the corner gave him a partial view of the main passage. 4 men moved in a tactical formation, their figures ghostly under the faint light. Their uniforms bore no insignia, only matte black armor and compact carbines. The lead man was tall and powerfully built, his movements precise, his commands low and clipped. Even from a distance, Joe saw the glint of a scar cutting diagonally across the man's cheek beneath his night vision goggles. That man was Gareth Hodge, and though Joe had never met him, he recognized the type immediately. A professional mercenary, ex-special forces, the kind who'd traded loyalty for paychecks. Gareth was in his mid-40s, square-jawed and cold-eyed, with the posture of someone who believed in control above all things. Rumor once tied him to the disbanded Shadow Response Unit, soldiers dismissed for war crimes overseas. Now he worked freelance for whoever offered the most money, and Aegis Tactical paid very well. "Check every chamber," Gareth ordered, voice low but resonant. "The agent's locator pinged here 2 hours ago. Reed wants confirmation." One of the men, younger, jittery, Corbin, nodded. He was in his late 20s, face pale beneath his helmet, eyes darting nervously. Not a hardened killer, Joe noted, probably ex-private security. Another man, Silva, moved beside him, lean and wiry, his head shaved smooth, his expression detached. Silva's movements were quiet and efficient, the sign of experience. Joe's mind raced. They had followed Laura's beacon, maybe even her blood trail. The front hatch was locked, but they could easily breach it with charges. He glanced back toward where Laura lay. Her breathing was faint but present. He couldn't move her far, and he couldn't fight 4 trained men in this narrow corridor. He touched Arrow's collar, whispering, "Stay." The dog froze, eyes gleaming in the faint light. Joe pulled the pistol from his thigh holster and began moving silently down a side tunnel that branched off to the left. It led to the auxiliary power chamber. The map on the wall had shown it earlier. Maybe he could draw them away. The corridor narrowed into an old maintenance shaft lined with dormant cables. He crouched behind a rusted generator, heart steady, and waited. The mercenaries advanced methodically, checking each room, their flashlights sweeping across the walls like searching blades. When they reached the point where Laura was, Gareth raised a fist. Halt signal. Joe held his breath. Arrow, still guarding Laura, growled softly but didn't move. Gareth's head turned sharply. "You hear that?" "Something down the west corridor," Silva replied. Gareth's tone hardened. "Check it. Now." As Silva and Corbin moved off, Joe took his chance. He grabbed a loose steel nut from the floor and threw it down the far end of the maintenance shaft. The clatter rang out like a whisper of hope and drew their lights instantly. 2 beams of light cut through the darkness. Joe stayed motionless, counting their footsteps. When they passed his position, he rose and struck. The motion was fast, instinctual. He caught Silva in a chokehold from behind, pulling him backward into shadow. The man struggled, elbowed hard, but Joe twisted sharply, cutting off his air. Within seconds, the body went limp. Joe eased him down silently. But the other, Corbin, turned, half heard the noise, and fired. The shot tore a hole through the air, sparks dancing as it hit the wall inches from Joe's shoulder. The bunker erupted in chaos. Gareth's shout echoed, "Contact! Move!" Joe ducked, firing 2 quick rounds toward the muzzle flash. Corbin screamed and fell. Gareth's boots pounded the concrete, his voice calm despite the gunfire. "Push him to the lower level. He's ex-military. Don't give him a line of sight." Joe grabbed Silva's rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and ran. Arrow, sensing the fight, sprinted from Laura's side to intercept him, his body a streak of gray and white in the gloom. Joe motioned for him to follow as he dashed into another tunnel marked sub-level access. The stairs descended into a cavernous maintenance area, massive fuel tanks, old crates, and forgotten machinery. The air was thick with dust. Joe's lungs burned as he slid behind a pillar, checking the Pelican case still strapped to his back. He needed time. Time to think. Time to get Laura out. But time was bleeding away. Gareth's voice came again, closer now, echoing through the tunnel system. "You can't hide forever, soldier. You've got something that doesn't belong to you." Joe's reply was silence. He scanned the room and spotted an old emergency fuel line snaking along the ceiling. The valves still gleamed faintly under his light. With one twist, he loosened the connector, the smell of diesel filling the air. Then, from his pack, he pulled a flare. Arrow watched him, ears twitching, tail stiff, a silent understanding between man and dog. Joe whispered, "Back!" When Gareth's team entered the room, their lights cut through the haze, sweeping the space. The flare hissed to life in Joe's hand, casting everything in blood-red light. Then he rolled it across the floor. The mercenaries shouted, realizing too late. The explosion wasn't massive, just enough to turn the air into a shockwave of heat and noise. The overhead pipes burst, showering sparks. Joe dove behind a crate, Arrow leaping beside him. Smoke filled the room. Gareth, coughing, barked orders to retreat. Joe didn't wait. He sprinted toward the eastern exit, Arrow at his side. They climbed back up through a secondary passage, emerging in a narrow junction where the walls had collapsed from old erosion. Joe stopped, catching his breath. His shoulder throbbed from shrapnel burns, but he was alive. Arrow nudged his leg, whining softly. They made it back to Laura. She was barely conscious, eyes half open. "You still here?" she whispered. "Still here," Joe said, kneeling beside her. He checked her pulse. It fluttered weakly. Laura's hand trembled as she reached toward him. "They'll come again. Take the coordinates. Echo fall. Don't stop." Joe clasped her hand briefly, then laid it back against her chest. "I won't." The emergency lights flickered once more, fading to darkness. Somewhere in the distance, Gareth cursed over his radio. He wasn't dead. Not yet. Joe lifted the Pelican case, secured it, and whispered to Arrow, "We're moving." The dog rose, limping slightly but alert, his eyes glowing like twin embers in the gloom. As they disappeared down the final tunnel, leaving behind the dying hum of the bunker, Joe glanced back one last time. Laura's face was still, peaceful under the fading light. She had fought her war and passed the torch to him. Outside, the rain began again, hammering the earth above, as if the mountain itself mourned the truth buried within. Rain hammered the Appalachian mountains above like a relentless drum, its rhythm seeping through the fractured rock and dripping into the tunnels below. Joe could hear it even down here, a muffled roar, the sound of the earth bleeding. The corridor trembled with each distant rumble of thunder. The air was growing heavier. The ventilation system had gone silent. The last faint hum of moving air died with a mechanical sigh. The mercenaries had found the intake vents. They were cutting off oxygen to smoke him out. Joe wiped the grime from his face, his breath fogging in the cold air. Arrow's coat was slick with moisture, his flanks rising and falling rapidly as he sniffed the stale air. The dog's ears flicked back, listening. Distant clicks of boots, faint but unmistakable somewhere behind the walls. Joe knew what they were doing. Choke them out, make them panic, then move in. He knelt beside Laura, who lay on a makeshift cot of old canvas and folded uniforms scavenged from a supply room. Her skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor, veins faintly visible under the dim yellow light. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, the kind that came with blood loss and shock. She was alive, but barely. Joe had found an emergency med kit in a rusted cabinet, gauze, iodine, an ancient IV bag of saline that might still work. He tore it open, hanging it from a bent pipe above her. His fingers, rough and calloused, worked with calm precision despite the tremor of fatigue. Arrow stood guard at the entrance, head low, tail stiff, growling deep in his throat. Laura's eyes fluttered open as Joe tightened the bandage around her shoulder. "Still here," she murmured, her voice weak but threaded with dry humor. "You make it sound like I had somewhere else to be," Joe said quietly. He checked the IV line. The fluid was barely trickling. "You're dehydrated. This might buy you time." Her gaze was glassy but alert. "Not much of it left," she whispered. Joe didn't answer. He knew the wound had gone septic. Her pulse was erratic, her skin cold. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She motioned weakly toward the recorder clipped to her vest. A small, military-grade digital unit, scuffed, but functional. "I need to finish this," she said, voice trembling. Save your strength. No, she breathed, determination flashing like a dying spark. This is what matters. Joe hesitated, then nodded. He unhooked the recorder, pressed the red button, and set it close to her mouth. Laura took a shaky breath, her voice coming out low and deliberate. This is Agent Laura Brooks. Field designation Echo Fall. If this reaches command, or anyone left willing to listen, Aegis Tactical has breached containment protocols. CEO Isabella Reed authorized illegal arms transfers to paramilitary clients across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Routes confirmed through Delaware and international offshore accounts under codename Sentinel Network. Key intermediaries include Colonel Grant Weston, retired U.S. Army logistics, presumed deceased, but operating under an alias. Transaction timestamp, June 4, 2022. Her words broke off into a ragged cough. Joe steadied her, holding the IV line in place. Easy, Agent. You're losing too much blood. Laura shook her head, forcing herself upright an inch. Keep recording. Joe hit resume. Delivery units were disguised as humanitarian shipments, each marked under Aegis Relief Initiative. Reed's partner in distribution, Nathan Cole, head of Vector Supply. Coordinates for the final shipment, secured in drive Delta 9. Password chain begins Sierra 49 Delta, cross-linked with date, July 1st, 2019. She gasped, clutching her ribs, her eyes glazing for a second before snapping back to focus. If I don't make it, the hard drive in the Pelican case and this message, get them to Ben Carter. He's the last one who can expose them. The recorder blinked red, low battery. Joe quickly unplugged his flashlight battery pack and rigged it to the recorder's port with a stripped wire. The device buzzed, then stabilized. Go on, he urged. Laura's lips moved faintly. Reed, she'll come after you now. She never leaves loose ends. Joe leaned closer. Then she'll find I'm harder to cut than most. For a moment, her expression softened, a tired, knowing smile. You sound like my first CO. He died in Kandahar. Joe's throat tightened, but he said nothing. Memories of sand, smoke, and the smell of burnt oil crawled up from somewhere he thought he'd buried. He looked away, his jaw tight. Let's finish this. Laura exhaled slowly, her breath rattling. To whoever finds this recording, tell my sister, Emily Brooks of Raleigh, North Carolina, I didn't disappear. I stayed, because someone had to. The recorder clicked off as its power died completely. Laura's head slumped back, eyes closing, the faintest trace of peace in her features. Joe checked her pulse. It fluttered weakly beneath his fingers, then stopped. He stayed there a long time, the silence thick enough to choke on. Arrow whined softly, resting his muzzle on Joe's knee. Joe reached down, absently scratching the dog's ear. She was tougher than most, he murmured. The low thump of rotor blades vibrated through the air. A drone closer now, scanning for heat signatures through the storm. Joe rose to his feet, staring up at the dripping ceiling. Time had run out. He unplugged the recorder, wiped it clean, and tucked it into his chest pocket. The Pelican case went over his shoulder, the straps creaking against his jacket. Arrow paced beside him, restless, the fur along his spine standing. They moved deeper into the maintenance sector, where the tunnels branched like veins. Joe followed faded markings on the walls, yellow paint, numbers half erased by mildew, until they reached a steel grate that opened into a secondary vent shaft. Rainwater poured down it in thin, icy streams. He climbed, one hand gripping the slick rungs, the other balancing the case. Arrow followed close, claws scraping metal. The shaft led to an outlet behind a cluster of moss-covered rocks. Outside, the world was shrouded in mist and thunder. The forest had turned into a storm-soaked labyrinth, branches bending under sheets of rain. Joe crouched low, scanning the ridge. In the distance, two faint red dots cut through the gray, infrared sensors sweeping the tree line. The drones were hunting. "Come on," he whispered. Arrow pressed close as they moved, slipping through ferns and shadow, the storm covering their sound. Behind them, deep beneath the earth, the bunker hummed one last time before its generators died completely. By dawn, Laura Brooks's voice would be nothing more than static, unless Joe made it out. The rain had not stopped. By dawn, it had turned the mountains into rivers of fog and slate, the clouds hanging low enough to swallow the trees whole. Joe and Arrow climbed through the soaked forest, their bodies slick with mud, their breath visible in the freezing air. The pelican case hung heavy on Joe's back, its weight more than just metal and secrets. It was the last will of a dying agent. Behind them, the bunker's entrance lay buried under a fresh landslide, sealed forever by rain and earth. Ahead waited whatever Laura Brooks had died to show him, the widow's maw. Joe's muscles burned as he pushed upward along the ridge. His face was drawn, the lines deeper than they had been a day ago. Mud streaked his stubble, exhaustion shadowed his eyes, but they were clear, resolute. He had that look soldiers get when they've already accepted there's no turning back. Arrow padded close beside him, tail low, his fur clumped from rain. The dog was quieter now. The usual spark in his amber eyes dimmed to a steady, loyal focus. He had watched Laura die, and dogs, Joe knew, didn't forget things like that. The coordinates on the blood-stained map led them higher into the mountains, where the forest thinned into bare stone. The wind howled through narrow passes, carrying the scent of iron and storm water. At last, they reached it, a jagged fissure in the cliffside, half hidden by vines and mist. The entrance yawned black and narrow, the rock around it streaked with mineral veins that glistened in the rain. It looked like a wound torn into the mountain, a place that swallowed sound and light. Joe crouched near the opening, brushing wet moss from a rusted metal sign bolted to the stone. The letters were almost erased, but he could still make them out. Widow's Maw Mining Facility, closed 1954. He remembered Laura's voice in his head, faint and rasping. "It's your only way out, and the only way in." He tested the air, cold, stale, faintly metallic, perfect for hiding something that shouldn't exist. Arrow growled softly, hackles rising. "Yeah," Joe murmured. "I don't like it either." They stepped inside. The world immediately changed. Sound died, replaced by the slow drip of water echoing from somewhere deep within. Joe switched on his headlamp. The beam cut across the tunnel's ribbed walls, revealing old wooden supports, rusted mining carts, and the remains of an elevator shaft long collapsed. Faded warning posters still clung to the concrete. Caution, gas pockets, no smoking. They followed the main passage for nearly an hour, the light bobbing ahead in rhythmic swings. Joe's boots squelched in the mud, Arrow's claws clicking softly on rock. The air grew colder with every step until their breath came in white clouds. Then the tunnel widened abruptly into a large chamber, and Joe stopped dead. Someone had been here recently. In the center of the chamber stood a generator, old but functional, its engine silent but not dusty. Nearby, a folding table with a portable computer, a thermos, and a half-eaten ration bar. On the far wall, a camp cot and a lantern still faintly warm. Whoever was here had left minutes ago. Arrow sniffed the ground, circling. Joe's gaze fell on a notebook left open on the table. The writing was clean, deliberate, rows of coordinates, supply drop times, names. Some were crossed out, others circled in red. But one name froze him where he stood: Gareth Hodge. Joe's jaw tightened. So he made it here first. A sound behind him, faint gravel shifting. Joe turned, weapon raised. A figure stepped out from the shadows, hands raised. "Easy," the stranger said. He was in his 30s, tall and lean, dressed in soaked hiking clothes layered with a tactical vest. His hair was dark blonde, unkempt from days in the field. A short beard traced his jaw, and behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his blue eyes carried the raw edge of exhaustion. He wasn't a soldier, not exactly. More like someone who'd been pretending to be one just long enough to survive. "My name's Ben Carter," he said, voice steady but low. "Laura sent me." Joe kept his pistol level. "You've got proof of that?" Ben nodded slowly and pulled from his jacket a small metallic badge, scratched but recognizable. The same insignia Joe had seen on Laura's ID. "She told me if anything happened, you'd have the drive." Arrow moved between them, growling deep in his chest. Ben froze, letting the dog sniff the air around him before speaking again. "I'm not armed. I came through the South Ridge. They're still tracking the signal from her locator, but I scrambled the frequency. We don't have long." Joe lowered his weapon slightly, studying him. The man looked like someone more used to newsrooms than firefights. Still, there was something steady in the way he stood. A quiet defiance that reminded Joe of people who'd already risked too much. "She said you were a journalist," Joe said finally. "I was," Ben replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "Now I guess I'm just the last guy left who still gives a damn." Joe gave a short nod. "Then help me make this worth it." They worked quickly. Ben booted the laptop on the table, its screen glowing pale blue in the darkness. Joe set the Pelican case beside it and keyed in the access code. Inside, the sealed hard drive gleamed under the light. "This is everything she died for," Joe said quietly. Ben's hands trembled slightly as he connected it. "Then let's make sure no one can bury it again." The files began to decrypt, progress bar crawling painfully slow. Outside, thunder rolled again. Joe paced the perimeter, scanning for movement. Arrow's ears twitched. Then, distant, the unmistakable echo of footsteps. Not one pair, several. The mercenaries had found the secondary entrance. "They're here," Joe muttered. Ben's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Almost done. 20 seconds." Arrow barked once, sharp, warning. Joe aimed toward the tunnel mouth, the beam of his light catching the first glint of a rifle barrel. He fired. The shot echoed like thunder. Screams followed, bullets ricocheting off stone. 10 seconds, Ben shouted, ducking behind the table. Joe switched to the suppressed M4 he'd taken earlier, short bursts keeping the attackers pinned. Arrow lunged forward, barking fiercely, forcing the enemy to scatter. Then the laptop beeped. "Upload complete," Ben yelled. Joe grabbed the device, yanked the cables free. "Shut it down and move!" They ran through the opposite tunnel, gunfire chasing them like metal rain. The passage narrowed into a crawl space, forcing them to duck as rocks fell from the ceiling. A blast went off behind them, Gareth's voice roaring orders. Joe didn't look back. He shoved Ben ahead, Arrow following close. Light flickered ahead, the faint glow of the surface. They burst out into the open, the dawn breaking pale and cold over the valley. Below them, a narrow ledge overlooked the forest. The air filled with mist, and the distant whine of engines. Joe turned, weapon raised, and saw Gareth emerging from the cave mouth, eyes burning beneath the visor of his helmet. "This isn't over, Miller," Gareth shouted. Joe fired once, forcing him back into the dark. "It is for you." The echo died. Joe lowered his weapon, breathing hard. Arrow stood beside him, panting, soaked to the bone but alive. Ben looked at him, rain streaking his face. "You just bought us the truth," he said quietly. Joe nodded, eyes on the horizon where the storm finally began to break. "Let's make sure it sees daylight." They started down the mountain, 2 men and a dog carrying the last proof of a dead woman's fight, and the promise that her death would not be in vain. When the mountain finally fell silent and the first light broke through the clouds, Joe didn't see victory. He saw grace, the kind that doesn't roar or demand. It whispers. In the sound of the rain easing, in Arrow's steady heartbeat beside him, in the faint warmth that reached through the cold mist. It was the reminder that even in the darkest tunnels, God never left. Laura's courage, Ben's faith, Joe's resilience, none of them were coincidences. They were threads woven by a hand greater than their own. Maybe it wasn't luck that guided Joe through the widow's maw, but a quiet miracle, the kind that happens when someone chooses to do good, even when no one is watching. And maybe that's what the story really asks of us, to believe that light still finds its way into broken places, through an act of kindness, a word of truth, or a single prayer whispered in the dark. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that hope, loyalty, and faith can still change lives, then don't let it end here. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Comment below what faith means to you in your everyday life. Subscribe to our channel so together we can keep spreading stories of courage, kindness, and the quiet miracles that prove God is still working among us. May the Lord bless you, protect your home, guide your heart through every storm, and remind you, as he reminded Joe and Arrow, that no path walked in love is ever truly lost.